tonight I just want to deal primarily with the specific questions that you had in what you asked before we started this series. So one of the questions was, how and when should the local congregation support a needy saint? So we've talked about the fundamentals of these things, but so one of the things that we saw is that when it's already specifically an individual Christian's responsibility, then they need to do that so that the church is not burdened. So the individual Christian is responsible for those in their family, and they should not burden the church with it instead of taking care of them personally. So when should you support a needy saint? Well, one of the things we need to note is that when it's not already someone else's responsibility to take care of them or to support them. And of course, they also do need to really be saints and really be in need, right? That seems obvious. A needy saint is exactly that. But, when you think about needs, food, clothing, and housing should somehow be ensured for those who walk orderly. So, Paul talked to the Thessalonians about those who were not walking orderly, that the church should not, and even the individuals should not be supporting them as they're not walking orderly. But for those that are walking as saints, as holy people, they do need to have food. They do need to have clothing. They do need to have somewhere to stay. So, those things do need to somehow be handled. And the church is responsible in as much as it's able. If it's not someone else's responsibility, then the church is responsible for helping those Christians to have those necessities. And I would put in medical emergencies are also definite needs. Now, in South Africa, we have government hospitals and things like that. So it's not as much of a problem as in a lot of other places in the world. But even here, costs are going to come up, cost of getting to the hospital, things like that. And so those, I would put those under necessities, even though it's not listed under the things that Paul talks about being content with, food and clothing. Housing isn't listed there either. But I do believe that these things are still necessities of life. And so we need to be looking at what is a true need, and then making sure that those needs are fulfilled as much as we are able. But a real need also is the spiritual needs. Those are also real needs. We need not only physical food, we need spiritual food. And so I would argue that if someone cannot afford to buy a Bible, probably an individual Christian can handle that, helping them out with it, but somehow they need to have that available to them. They need to have a Bible somehow, even if it's a loan of a Bible from the church or whatever, but somehow they need to be able to read their Bible. And also transportation costs. That's something that came up specifically. And I would argue that, yes, if somebody cannot get to church, they cannot meet with other Christians, they can't afford it, then if the church is able to provide that for them, to help them with that cost, even if it's not paying the whole thing, just helping them with what they're short, whatever. But I would argue that that's a real need, because it's a spiritual need to be with the brethren. So these are things that are where, if they're truly saints and they're truly in need, then these are things that, if it's not someone else's responsibility, then the church should take on that responsibility in as much as it is able.
Do you maybe mind elaborating a little bit more on that transportation issue?
Yeah. So the idea of providing for the needs, right? That was something we saw over and over again. Providing for needs, and the question is it a spiritual need for someone to be with the brethren? I think all of us would agree that it is a spiritual need. It's something that the Lord wants us to do because it's good for us. It's, we become weak if we're not able to meet with the brethren. And so it's not saying that the church should just pay the transportation cost of everybody who's coming, because not everybody needs it. But there are some who cannot afford transportation to get to church. It's not necessarily saying, okay, we have to establish some official amount that we give to each person or something like that. We need to find out, what does the person need? Do they need help paying for transportation? And maybe we can ask the questions, as we'll get into some other of these questions tonight. But, we talked about it last time. But, why do they need what they need? If they're working, then why don't they have enough money for transportation to church? Are they able to get transportation other places? Are there some sacrifices that they could make so that the church is not burdened? Those are things that are needing to be discussed. But in the end, we do have to understand that transportation, for those that they have to have transportation to get to church if they're not in walking distance, and they cannot afford it, so they cannot meet with the brethren if they're not assisted, then the church, I believe, should be helping them with that. That's a need. It's a spiritual need, and spiritual needs are in some ways even more important than the physical needs. It's more in line with what the church is for. I don't know if that elaboration helped any.
Going back again to Acts chapter 2, where my brethren stayed longer than anticipated. Obviously, they were coming there for the Pentecost and everything, and they couldn't go back. But they stayed longer because as we see there, it says they will continue daily with the apostles' teachings and stuff like that, which is something that I think it's just maybe what the apostle was just fulfilling what Jesus had instructed them to do. For like when the funds were being sourced in the way whereby maybe selling position, whatever the case might be, the main reason for that was that maybe they could still be there to listen or to hear the word of God. Well, obviously we see later on when the persecution started, they start scattering all over the place. But one of the reasons that I would think that there was that need in that time was that they were staying on longer there so that they could hear the word of God. And we see Christians pulling money and bringing it to the apostles' feet so that obviously they could be sustained, maybe for food or housing or whatever the case. But I would say, to sum it all up, it was so that they can be able to hear the word of God. Again, I'm also looking at scriptures like Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, where it says, not forsaking the assembly of all ourselves, the men of some, but exhorting one another, so much as we see the day drawing near. So obviously, it's encouraging one another and assisting one another to try and help each other, so that at least we're able to congregate or to meet with each other and stuff like that. I'm just trying to think of typical scriptures that one would use to try and support this. But I don't know. So far, those are the ones that I can think about. I don't know if what brethren think about that. Also, there's Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 says, bear one another's burden. But obviously, maybe I don't want to take it out of context because probably the scope there could be a bit broader. But it's that idea of seeing that this brother is unable to be able to come and be able to be edified, and how do we help him and with this burden that he has or and stuff like that.
I think you're right. The reason why many of those were still there in Acts, even though it's not stated, but it does seem like many of them stayed so that they could hear the word. Yeah. And so a lot of that assistance they were giving one another was for that purpose. Yeah. And we need to hear the word just as much today, although we do have Bibles we can read at home. So we have that advantage, but we do have still need to come together, as you said in Hebrews 10, and certainly even the Apostle Paul, he hated to be by himself. It seems like when you read through those examples, he was by himself in Athens, but he sent word to come as quickly as they could, Timothy and Silas, because he didn't like being on his own. And yes, they were working together, but so are we. We're supposed to be working together and helping to spread the word to others as well. But and all of that is also involved in what we collect the money for and the purpose of the church. But we need to maintain our brethren's spiritual needs as much as we can, and a need is a need. Yeah. Thank you for those comments. All right. So another question was what things determine when a saint should not be assisted by the local congregation? So connected with the previous question, but a little bit different. So one of the things we looked at last time was a willingness to work, right? They have to be willing to work or they should not eat. They should not be assisted. And that also applies to the individuals, as he talked about that in Thessalonians. But they also must have a desire to live a quiet and peaceful life and provide for their own needs. They may not be able to provide for their own needs, but they need to have that desire. So how can we tell that they have that desire? Well, we can't completely. You can't know somebody's heart, but they can demonstrate this desire through how they spend what they do have. So if we're talking about money, how do they provide for their own needs with what they have? Are they doing what they can with what they have, or are they, if they're simply spending on the things that they want and then asking for help because they're out of money, that does not show a desire to actually provide for their own needs. Someone who desires to provide their own needs is going to pay for food, pay for housing, pay for transportation. Those things first, if they, as much as they're able, before they spend money on any want, before they spend money on anything that's not a requirement. This is, one of the things financial advisors talk to people about all the time is, stop spending money on, these, going to the coffee shop, or stop spending money on things that, like a new car, making payments. Sell that car, get, if you have to have a car, get an old car that's cheap that you can pay for, and then use that other money to pay off any debts you have. And all of that, you live below your means until you're out of debt, and then you can live within your means, but never live outside of your means. Of course, that's only possible if you have income at all, and enough to actually provide for all the actual essentials for you and your family. So, but that you can see, how are they spending what they have? Do they actually demonstrate a desire to live a quiet and peaceful life and provide for their own needs? And we talked about this last time as well. We need to be careful that nobody can blame the congregation in the distribution of the funds, or the people who are handling that for the congregation. And this means asking questions when that's needed. So making sure that we do know if this person really is in need, or maybe they just need some advice on how to handle their money better, or they need some maybe their real problem is they went to a loan shark and they're trying to pay that off, and so they never have money, and so maybe somebody is going to have to help them out with that, so that it's sorted. But all of those things are unfortunately problems that come up even among brethren, and we have to just ask questions and figure things out. And it's not always a straightforward answer. We have to use wisdom that God has given us, and try to demonstrate love for our brethren and respect for the Lord in the way that we distribute the funds. And so we have to sometimes make decisions that aren't going to make everybody happy. Well, we probably can't make everybody happy anyway. But we have to try to make the decisions that the Lord is going to be happy with, that show we have love for our brother, but also show that we're determined to do what the Lord wants done with the money that's collected for the church, and making the priorities right. So if somebody's not willing to work, they should not be assisted. If they do not show a desire to provide for their own needs, living a quiet and peaceful life, they need to repent, but they shouldn't be supported in that condition. And we need to be careful in how we distribute these funds, that we are giving them to those who are living properly and are truly in need. And when I say living properly, I don't mean that they can't be newer Christians who have a history of sinful life, but just that there can't be anything ongoing that we know about that they are involved in, which is, we're enabling through distributing the assistance to them. So we want to make sure we're actually helping people spiritually more than we are physically, but we do have to help them with the physical needs as well.
How then does the church decide that this is enough? If that's how what is enough? And also in terms of determining how much someone needs, I don't know how is that sort of decision made. If someone says I do not have enough, like I'm just trying to think about, so that that last point, that point we spoke about, that nobody blames the church in terms of how we're distributing these funds, and to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, if I can put it that way. How do we? Yeah, how do we follow that process, basically?
Yeah, it's really difficult. It really is, because if you help one person, then somebody else says, "Oh, but why aren't you helping me?" well, you're surviving and you didn't ask for help. That's, but we're not just trying to see, oh, should we hand out money? That's not the point. The point is to understand who has needs. And so if you, in our case, like we had a brother who was able to sit down and talk with this brother who was in need and just kind of go through what are his expenses, what's he paying for rent. And it wasn't, an extravagant amount or anything. It was, a very low rent place he was staying in. How much does he need for food? Now, that should be generally, an understood amount, I guess, for most people, for if you know how many people they're having to provide food for, you can kind of figure out how much they need for that. Because, some people aren't as good about shopping for food in a cost-effective way as others, but usually when people are already on that level where they're in need, they're figuring that out, how to make things stretch. And they still need to do that because the church isn't trying to, just take away, any problem or financial problem. It's helping them with their needs. That's what it's doing. And so you have those things: housing, food, and if there's a need for clothing, which isn't an expense that usually comes up that often, but those things come up, and they may have some other things that are true needs that they can explain about as well. But we need to try to talk to people and understand their situation. And that's the hard part, because a lot of people don't want to talk about their financial situation. But and we just, it's up to the church. I'm not telling you how to do it, because the scriptures don't tell us how to do it. But in my advice, and that's just advice, is to ask questions and find out why do they need what they say they need. And but if the church decides, well, we'll just trust them, we believe they're trustworthy. If they say they need this, then they need this. I think that's okay, but we need to be careful in that, just to make sure we're not opening up a problem where they're actually misusing their money, or they have misused their money, and now they're asking for assistance to get out of that without actually making changes in what how they're living, what they're doing, and the way that they're making those decisions. So, yeah, it's a hard thing to know who to help, how much is enough, but I think if you sit down and you look at expenses, what are their expenses, then we can come up with an amount that we can see whether the church is capable of providing them with that or not, or we can even think of other ways that they can cut expenses. We can advise them on, things that maybe they can even move in with a Christian family or something like that until they are able to provide for their own place. But we need to discuss those things openly or in private, but somehow we need to figure these things out. And there isn't any just one answer. The scriptures don't give us that. I think we're expected to use wisdom, and that, so it's not an easy thing.
Yeah, thank you. Just a follow-up question, sorry. Just based on the need to have these details the reason I'm asking, so my question is, does someone need to come forward to the church or to say that I have this need? Or the reason I'm asking that is because if then we'll need to ask certain questions or not, it will be quite difficult if, for instance, I notice that no, it seems this brother has this need, because I don't think if someone has to say something for you to see that there could be a need. But the reason I'm asking is because in a situation where you do see something and you know that in order for the congregation to help in terms of using the collection, there will need to be certain steps that are taken to ensure that it is a need indeed. Then does someone need to proactively come and speak to the congregation, or for it to be, hey, how can I ask this question? But basically, does someone need to come forward to say, yes, I have this need, or can we proactively um, go ahead and try and assist?
Yeah. Well, if you think of Acts chapter 6 with the widows, it wasn't the widows that came to the apostles anyway to talk about how, the Greek-speaking widows were being neglected. It was just the Christians who were Greek-speaking came to the apostles and said, our widows are being neglected. Now, that doesn't mean that the widows didn't speak to them first, but I don't believe it has to be the person coming and saying to the church, I have a need. But that is certainly a way to know when somebody comes and says that. But if you know somebody has a real need, there's nothing wrong with bringing that up to the congregation. Yeah, I think that would certainly fit within the illustration of, or the example of Acts 6.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to just add something else. Like also James, also I think James chapter 3 also chapter 2 also helps, whereby it says that like if a brother or sister is naked or destitute of daily food, and then we say to him, be warmed and stuff like that. So it doesn't really it's not as clear whether the person is coming or you saw him or something like that. But the whole point is that if you do see them, because the way it says that if a brother is naked, so I don't know if he's naked because or is destitute of daily food because he said so or you just noticed. But the idea is that if that need is identified, either way, it's questioning about faith. Like, can you really say that you have faith, but your works do not show? So if you just say to this specific brother, it's okay, be warmed, be filled, but do not provide what they need, can you truly say that your faith has works? I'm just throwing it as a comment.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. There, of course, it's on the individual level, but if you, I agree, if you see them in need, I think John talks about the same idea, but you won't provide for those needs, then you don't have love and you don't have faith, as James talks about. And we may not always be able to personally provide those needs, and then we would bring it to the church. But of course, if we're the ones who become aware of a need and we're capable of handling it, there's no reason to bring it to the church. We can just do that ourselves. But yeah, in a lot of cases, brethren who find out about the needs aren't in a position themselves to provide for that themselves, so they could bring that up to the church. Good points. All right. So another question that we had was, who are needy saints? So we've already talked about that a good bit, but just basically those who do not have the ability to provide their necessities. So it's not about their wants. And there can be a difference of opinion in what are necessities. And I think every congregation is going to have to decide on what they believe is a necessity. But the basics are food, clothing, and housing, I would argue. But definitely food and clothing. And I would argue housing of some sort, and medical care if necessary. And then there's the spiritual needs that we talked about. Some would argue that education is necessary. So, you need to pay for their schooling or their children's schooling or something like that. That gets into some areas where there can be a lot of debate. And I don't want to get into that. But, I think if you as an individual want to help with that, then absolutely no problem, right? That's not a bad thing. I'm not going to condemn a church for doing that, but I'm not sure that fits into necessities, but many people think it does, and that's a matter of opinion, so church is going to have to discuss that if it ever comes up. And there may be other things like that, where some people think of it as a necessity, others do not. But, we can think of, what is really needed, and they don't have the ability to provide it. In the Old Testament, widows, fatherless, and foreigners are the ones that were commonly mentioned as those in need. And that doesn't mean that all widows or all fatherless or all foreigners are needy. But it gives us an idea of why someone might be genuinely in need, because they are not in a position in society where they can make a living for themselves, the same as just a man who is from that area. And they're not. It's not that they're lazy or that they are, wasteful or something like that. They're just genuinely in a difficult position, and that there's others who can be in that position as well. When we talk about the word saints, it indicates that they are holy people. And so somebody might just consider, well, if it says saints and they're holy, does that include children? I don't know if that's a question that's come up there. It might only come up in my own mind, but children are considered holy by Christ. They're different. It's different than a Christian. Children are not sinners because they're not capable of sin. There is no law for them. But as they grow, they become accountable to the law, and then they sin and are no longer holy. But it refers to those who lived righteously under the Old Testament. We see those passages in Psalm 16, verse 3. As for the saints who are on the earth, they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. Psalm 34:9, O fear the Lord, you his saints. Matthew 27, verse 51 through 53, talks about how the graves were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Those are the people from the Old Testament. And so, this term saints is used to talk about just holy people in general, not only Christians. But when we're talking about the contribution and what it's used for by the churches, the context of the passages actually make it clear that the saints are Christians, that this contribution is for. So in Romans 15, verse 25 through 31, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors. For the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things. So if you see, well, who is it that is sharing the spiritual things? It's not children, it's Christians. And then when you get down to verse 31, he talks about this service for Jerusalem being acceptable to the saints. These are people who are, they're mentally capable of evaluating and seeing and approving of what he's doing. These are Christians that he's talking about here. In 1 Corinthians 1, verse 2, he talks about those who are called to be saints. That's how that term is usually used in the Bible. This is not, you're not born a saint. You're born again to be a saint, but you're called to be saints, sanctified in Christ. 1 Corinthians 14:33 talks about the churches of the saints, and that's certainly talking about Christians. In 1 Corinthians 16, in verse 1, he talks about the collection for the saints. But then even when you get down to verse 15 in the same chapter, he talks about the household of Stephanas, that that it is the first fruits of Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the ministry of the saints, that you also submit to such, and to everyone who works and labors with us. This ministry of the saints was pretty clearly the work with the Christians in the context here. And so this collection for the saints should be the same saints that he's talking about here. All right, so that's just to try to explain what is a needy saint. Okay. Are there any comments or questions about that? I think we already covered a lot of it, but okay. All right, so another question that we had was, should the local congregation assist a saint with transportation funds to come to a worship service, which we already talked about that. But one of the things to remember is that the saints should try not to burden the church and provide for their own needs, right? So if you can provide your own transportation, even walking, whatever it is, see what you can do not to burden the church. That's something that we see is the attitude that Paul had, that others had, that they did not want to burden the church. And we should have that same attitude. But if it's a need, it's a need, right? But we should be trying to provide for our own needs. And then if an individual can assist someone to get to church, that's better, because they're also not burdening the church with that problem. If you're driving and you're going, in the same general area where somebody is who needs a lift to church, and you can give them that assistance, great. That's better than having the church do it. Okay, so, but not everybody is going to be in a position to do that either. So there are going to be situations where individuals can't really handle that, especially if it's on a bigger scale. But if it's just one or two people who need help, then a couple of individuals can probably handle that. But the church also doesn't need to just say, okay, you guys handle this yourselves, because that's not right either. It needs to be coming from them. It needs to come from the individuals, unless for some reason you view this as actually their responsibility, and you're trying to help them fulfill that by pushing them towards doing it. But if in general, it should be coming from the individual saying, no, I want to do this because I think this is something the Lord is going to be happy with, me helping them in this way. But if someone cannot get to church, if they really can't get there without assistance, that's a genuine need. as far as I understand it. Now, I understand that sometimes people are sick, physically unable to go to church, and it's not wrong for them not to come to church when they're physically unable. Paul didn't go to church when he was in prison unless the church met in the prison, right? But he was not sinning by that. But there's a difference between not sinning and growing, right? We do need to come together to grow, and it's a need. And if it's something we can help them with, then it's something that we should help them with. If it's something that they have to have help with, and so it's still going to fall within the ability of the church to provide. If the church cannot provide that for them, well, then it can't, right? What's acceptable is according to ability, not what's not there. We can't do what's not available, but there should be the willingness to help regardless of whether we can or not. And so we should want to get into a position where we can help those who are unable to come if that's a problem. But we should use wisdom to try to find the best way, that's not going to waste the Lord's resources, because they're limited. What our contribution's limited. We want to use it in the most pleasing to God way as possible, and so we've got to use wisdom in all of that. We may find a cheaper way for them to get to church, whatever it is, but we want to really focus on helping and pleasing God at the same time, and all of that takes a lot of wisdom, which there's going to have to be discussions and debates, and it's not fun, but that's why we need elders. We really need elders in our churches to help us with these things and sort these things out for us. But since we don't have elders, we've got to use the wisdom as best we can. Okay, so that's the end of what I was going to talk about tonight.